do you see what happens when you stop seeing the other as a human? We need to bring our reason back, because this is the only way. If we don't see the dehumanization of the other that is in full swing now, we will not be able to end this, and it will be extremely detrimental both to the Palestinians and to the Israelis.
In May 2022, the Italian lawyer and academic Francesca Albanese became the first woman to assume the role of UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. At the time, she couldn't have predicted how events in the fall of 2023, about 18 months into her tenure, would transform the lives of millions of Palestinians and Israelis and thrust her into the global spotlight. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. Hamas's deadly attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, killed 1,200 people, including over 600 civilians and 39 children. Israel's subsequent attacks on Gaza have now killed over 50,000 people, including over 14,500 children, according to UNICEF, displaced millions, and flattened much of the territory. Francesca Albanese has become a polarizing global personality due to her forceful and unrelenting defense of the rights of Palestinians and her equally powerful condemnation of Israel's protracted assault on the Palestinian people. Albanese has consistently called Israel's actions in Gaza genocide and has demanded that the world stop the carnage. As a UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese travels the world giving interviews, delivering speeches, and filing extensive reports. Her job is high-profile, stressful, and comes with enormous responsibility and considerable risk. It's also unpaid. Francesca Albanese is effectively a devoted volunteer who enthusiastically gives of her free labor. The job of Special Rapporteur consumes her, but she thinks the sacrifice is worth it. Despite facing intense opposition from the United States, Canada, Israel, France, and Germany, in early April 2025, Francesca Albanese was reappointed by the UN's Human Rights Council to a new 3-year term as Special Rapporteur. It means she'll be in the position until 2028. In November 2024, Francesca Albanese came to Canada, and it is then that I had a chance to sit down with her when she paid a visit to our studio in Ottawa. What followed was a wide-ranging conversation about the plight of the Palestinian people, the horrors that the world has been witnessing in Gaza, allegations that she is anti-Semitic, and her own personal journey. Here's our conversation. Francesca, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Adrian.
Francesca, you took this role after a Canadian was in the role of Special Rapporteur, Michael Lynk. Was the Special Rapporteur job something that you always were imagining you would eventually occupy?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, I can tell you that so many things that have happened in my life over the past 15 years are things that I had never expected to do, including writing a book for academic purposes or teaching in university, because as you said, I'm a human rights lawyer and I've been working for the United Nations for a decade before stepping down and then continuing working in the humanitarian sphere with NGOs when I had moved after Palestine to the United States. But then I realized I was not particularly in my element. I didn't want to work on humanitarianism. I had several critiques, and this is where I moved in a way to academia. I had never thought to be a producer of academic research. I was an avid user of academic research. And same thing, a few years later, as I was disseminating my book, Palestinian Refugees in International Law, I had the chance to be in a panel with former Special Rapporteur, Professor Michael Lynk. Yes, he's Canadian. It was the time of COVID, so there were a lot of people participating, watching webinars. And Michael and he was a discussant in one of the panels where I was presenting the book, after which he reached out to me and he said, I listened to you and I think you would be a splendid candidate as a Special Rapporteur. Have you ever thought of such an opportunity? And of course, the answer was no. Whatever he saw planted a seed in me. And over the following year, I've been thinking of it also because I was working on the question of Palestine from an academic, but also from an advocacy point of view. So at a certain point, yes, I expressed my interest to the United Nations, and then I was considered, interviewed by the Human Rights Council, and here I am. And what does a special rapporteur is and does? There are 50 independent experts of the United Nations, and all of us experts in their own domains. So the majority of us are international lawyers, mostly academics, but also from different parts of life. But what characterizes us is both who we are, again, experts on thematic issues like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the right to food, the right to health, adequate housing, or experts in given geographic areas. My area of expertise was Palestine, Israel-Palestine, Palestinian refugees. But there is also something which it's a characteristic of all of us. We are also human rights defenders, people who do not shy away from the responsibility of undertaking human rights causes, including difficult one, sensitive one, speaking truth to power. This is what an independent expert is. It's a human rights voice mandated by the United Nations to monitor and report to the United Nations on grave human rights violations, on violations of international law that occur either on a given topic or in a given area. In my area is the occupied Palestinian territory. And of course, on top of it, there is the possibility to undertake other actions, individual investigations, and anything that makes sense within the realm of the mandate.
Mm-hmm. Michael Link saw something in you. He felt that you would be a fine special rapporteur. What were the qualities that he saw in you? What do you think those were?
First, the work that I had done was significant in terms of knowledge of the reality on the ground. I had been working for over a decade with the United Nations, including the last stint in occupied Palestine. So I knew the reality on the ground. I had produced an important book that looked at the question of Palestine through the human face of that tragedy, which is the fate of the million Palestinian refugees that originated from what was the creation of the State of Israel, that whatever reason legitimized this. We cannot forget that it meant the displacement of 750,000 people back then and the destruction of 500 Palestinian villages and much violence, the dismemberment of a nation. So I followed the Palestinian forced displacement ever since, both from historical Palestine, from the occupied Palestinian territory, the Israel occupied, so the Gaza Strip, the West Bank and East Jerusalem in 1967, and it has been unlawfully occupied ever since. So you see the profound injustice, but also Palestinians have been mistreated in most of the Arab countries where they fled, where they sought refuge. And so there has been a lot of issues with their legal status and treatment that I decided to map and study and also monitor in the Palestinian diaspora in other parts of the world, including the Americas, Asia, and Africa. So Michael saw that I had that knowledge. I had an scholarly contribution, but I also he saw what he named as, you have this fire and this grace, you are able to talk about this with a candor, with a frankness that is important. So I think it was the combo that is and that you see as well today.
I'm curious as to where that fire came from, and how does a woman who was born in the mountains outside of Naples end up becoming a special rapporteur, end up becoming an expert on Palestine? How did you come to this kind of focus and this concentration?
Yeah, this is something interesting because nothing really of the world I come from really prepared me to this. Like many mountain places, I come from a community which is quite closed, not very hospitable, but hard to penetrate from outside, and where people tend to stay and not to leave. We have our sense of comfort and security in our community. This is really a feature of the people I come from. And then here I was anxious to leave, anxious to discover the world. So there's always been a sort of restlessness in me for a long time. Now it's gone, but I think motherhood changed a lot of things that gave me that grounding. But I've been always on the move and very, very curious about the world, very instinctively, naturally, the fire has always been ignited by injustice. I've always been someone speaking out against the bullies and against forms of little discriminations that I saw. It's something in me. And also, I come from a part of the world where the question of Palestine was very heartfelt as I was growing up. So Palestine was not a foreign issue, it was a domestic issue for many, many Italians. One of the first memories I have is of the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, which broke the scenes, broke our joy as we as an Italians were celebrating the World Cup.
That was in 1982.
92, well, we had won the World Cup, and all of a sudden there is this massacre that fills our life with the horror it carried. We were not desensitized at all back then. And so, I grew up with this sense of self-curious, but also quite vocal about injustices. Then I studied law, and probably this contributed. But what has made me who I am? Probably two things. I found myself saying this in Canada more than other places because I think that there is something very local that people need to be able to relate to. I come from a land which is historically plagued by criminality and the mafia. And I think that people abroad have no full understanding of what the mafia is, and they think that it's made of dirty people fighting over dirty businesses. In fact, the mafia is made of white collars. It's made of a system within a system. It's made of corrupt bankers, politicians, lawyers, and journalists, and everything participates in committing and covering up for crimes. And those who have stood against the system have often paid with their own life. And what the mafia culture has been thriving on is the capacity to silence the people. When the people reacted to this, for example, we have had, as I was growing up, we have had two assassinations of two very strong judges, Falcone and Borsellino, who stood against the mafia and who have changed the course of history for the mafia, because after that, everything changed. There was a massive campaign of arrest, and this is where the people woke up and realized that the mafia could always hit anyone, including the defenders. So I do recognize when there are these techniques of silencing people in order to defend crimes. You see what I mean?
You've been saying that there has been some covering up going on. There's been some silencing going on when it comes to what's going on in Palestine, what's going on in Gaza and the occupied territories. How would you describe what has been going on in Palestine in the last year?
Adrian, before telling you what has happened over the past year, which is very gruesome and also painful to cope with and listen to, it makes sense to spend a minute to describe what was the life in the occupied Palestinian territory before October 7, because that place has been a macrocosm of abuses for decades. People often do not realize, but the illegality of Israel's occupation. Israel has maintained for 57 years a system of martial rule. Over 4-5 million Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. So military orders written by soldiers, enforced by soldiers, reviewed in military courts by soldiers, including for children as young as 12. The mass incarceration of Palestinians. For what? They have been treated as a security threat to Israel, as they have tried to resist the dispossession, the taking of the land by the army and violent settlers. And I would like then to return to this because there are Canadian citizens who are part of this unlawful endeavor. And so the Palestinians have over time been increasingly repressed, increasingly segregated, and the daily humiliation. The apartheid was not just structural. Martial law for the Palestinians and a civil law for the Israeli settlers who shouldn't have been in the West Bank and East Jerusalem or in Gaza in the first place. There is also the abuses and the racism coming from the soldiers and the settlers treating the Palestinians like animals. It was apartheid. It was inscribed in the law, in the duality of the legal system. Let's not forget that Gaza, which has been closed up since 1993 and kept under a tight siege since 2007, under constant attack. There had been 5 wars between 2007 and October 2023, which had killed 5,000 people, including 1,200 children. You know, the year 2003, I dedicated part of my work to children and to document what the occupation was doing to them. I concluded the title of that report was Unchilding. Average 18-year-old person had not left Gaza ever in her entire life, but had gone through 5 wars, which had most likely killed people in her family or destroyed her homes. I remember this girl jealous of her friend who had been able to leave Gaza to go to be treated in the West Bank because she had leukemia. And she said, oh, but at least she could see the mountains, you know. So it's very difficult to understand that this is not to justify what happened on October 7 and last year, but what happened as of October 9 in Gaza has been a violent assault justified on using the rage and the fury and the trauma of the Israelis, which 12 months later has killed 45,000 Palestinians in Gaza, including 17,000 children, including 700 babies, and Gaza is destroyed. Do the Canadians know that? And do the Canadians know that are Canadian citizens who have been serving in the army, which is accused to have committed genocide? And do Canadians know that while the government condemns the settlements and recognizes these as illegal, Canadian citizens have been selling and buying Palestinian property in the West Bank, in Toronto and Montreal?
There are Israelis who would listen to this, listen to you, and say Francesca Albanese only sees one side. Francesca Albanese is inherently biased. Francesca Albanese does not recognize that Palestinians, many of them represent an existential threat to Israel, that some Palestinians have said explicitly that they want to rid themselves of the Israeli menace. And that is justification for this thing you call the occupation, that Israelis need to make sure that their people are secure. How do you respond to that?
First of all, I do not make a difference between Israelis and Palestinians, because especially throughout my experience as a special rapporteur, my engagement with the Israelis, as well as with Jewish communities and Jewish scholars and Jewish religious figures from all over the world, including Holocaust survivors, particularly this year, has been one of the most unexpected, but also profoundly enriching experiences. I often say that the rehumanization discourse includes both the Palestinians and the Israelis, because both are victims of an anachronistic settler colonial design. And I will explain why I speak of settler colonialism, because this is the framework that needs to be understood. Otherwise, what people think of when you say Israel-Palestine, they think of a conflict, which immediately make you think of a symmetry between the parties, in quote unquote, the Israelis on the one hand and the Palestinians. But this is a fallacy, because again, I say both Palestinians and Israelis are victims of an ideology which sees, as it's stipulated in the 2018 Israeli a nation-state law, the land of historical Palestine, not just Israel, but including the West Bank, is Jerusalem and Gaza, is treated by Israel as land for Jewish sovereignty only. So there is no recognition of the Palestinians whatsoever. Let's start with this. Israel exists as a state and has the sacrosanct right to protect itself, this territory, and its citizens. But this doesn't extend to the occupied Palestinian territory. This doesn't justify treating the Palestinians as an existential threat. And sorry, this is a very racist discourse that someone can represent an existential threat. This is what settler colonial powers have used, and this is how they have framed the indigenous people. The Palestinians were inhabitants of the land. The state of Israel has been created. Now it exists. Can it stay within the pre-1967 borders? This should be the question. Why Israel continues to build settlements, to take the land of the Palestinians, to demolish, as we speak, the land of the Palestinians, to aggress the Palestinian people. There are no two armies in conflict here. There is one people occupying and colonizing the land and clearly threatening both the Palestinians but also creating a security threat for its own citizens.
You have said what's going on in Gaza right now, being meted out by the Israeli government, the Israeli regime, is erasure. You've called it genocide. You've described in other interviews genocide as not being an act, but being a process. Explain to us what constitutes genocide.
Genocide is a very complex and insidious crime, and it is one of a series of acts of killing, infliction of severe bodily or mental harm, or creation of conditions of life that will lead a group as such in total or in part to destruction. It's a crime that is directed at a group, ethnical, religious, racial, or national group. So there is this collective element. It's not the targeting of individuals per se, which might amount to a crime of extermination, is when you target the group as such with intent. This is the critical element of genocide, when behind these crimes, these acts, which are crimes in and of themselves, there is an intent to destroy the group. And here I say there is a lot of confusion regarding what constitutes intent, and people tend to confuse intent with motives. Because they say, well, but Israel, in fact, wants to eradicate Hamas, so Israel wants to liberate the hostages.
Or to protect themselves.
Or to protect themselves, yes, but self-defense, whatever there was, doesn't justify the commission of destructive acts. And the destruction is not only in what has been said, the biblical reference to Amalek destroyed the woman, the child, the suckling, in fact, is the baby, the donkey, the camel, everything, is really a genocidal exhortation. It's not been limited to words. It has translated into policies, into military directives, which have considered every individual targetable as a terrorist or as a terrorist affiliate, and everything destroyable.
And yet your critics say that you misuse this term genocide. They say genocide is what happened in Rwanda in 1994 when hundreds of thousands of people were massacred. Genocide is what happened during the Second World War where millions of Jews were exterminated. 45,000 people in Palestine have been killed. That doesn't constitute genocide, Francesca Albanese.
Wow. First of all, it's not the numbers of people killed who constitute genocide, because in fact there are also acts of genocide which take place without even one killing. Think of the genocide, and Canada should know something about that. Think of genocide through the forcible transfer of children, like in Australia and in places like Canada, there has been
residential schools.
The residential schools separating. This was one part of the genocide. What constitutes genocide is not defined by historical experience or by personal opinion. It's written in the law.
So what's gone on in Palestine that proves your point that genocide is going to happen?
Yes. But again, in Bosnia, there were 8,000 people killed. And
in Srebrenica.
In Srebrenica, and it was recognized as genocide. Here, where I see there are three elements. The destructive intent. The intent is the determination to destroy. And again, it has been said, but it's also, look, there is a genocide scholar, William Shabazz, who's Canadian, by the way, who says, in order to determine genocide, you look at the words, what is being uttered, which is not genocide per se on its own. You look at the reality and the opportunity. Israel, after October 7th, says the opportunity to advance a plan that has been there for decades, the erasure of the Palestinians from the land.
What's the evidence of that?
The evidence is what has been said from the very beginning, and this is where I raised the alarm on October 14 when the Israeli army announced the forced displacement, as they call it, the evacuation of 1.1 million Palestinians from Gaza, saying whomever doesn't leave will be considered a terrorist affiliate. There were 1.1 million people. How do you evacuate? That was an unlawful order given. There were 22 hospitals which were targeted together with the doctors, the nurses, the patients, the IDPs. You know, there is something extremely important to recognize in the Holocaust of the Jewish people and the Roma and Sinti before the Second World War, but also in Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And now it's the dehumanization of the victim. The Palestinians have been dehumanized, called dogs, animals, subhumans, rats, monsters, Amalek. This has created the genocidal spirit that has led to the full destruction of Gaza. Gaza doesn't exist anymore. And the people living there are trapped, forced to live among the deaths, among the rubble. They have nothing left, and we are letting it happen. And there are acts of torture carried out. Even Israeli human rights organizations have denounced the network of torture centers. This is what Israeli detention centers have transformed into. Why to torture thousands of people? Why to brutalize, to humiliate? Because genocide is this. It's the totality of the crimes against the totality of the people in the totality of the land.
Your critics say you cross the line too often. You transgress. They've called you an anti-Semite. They say that your characterization, or even just comparing what's going on in Gaza right now with the Holocaust, is inherently anti-Semitic. And this is another example of the fact that you have inherent bias.
Let me state what is impartiality, because it's been used as a pompous word to cover up for indifference and cowardice. Impartiality is to look at the facts, and I look at the facts. I'm the first special rapporteur who reports on the violations committed in the occupied Palestinian territory by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. But this is, right now, the main violator of international law is Israel. Does it make me biased? So let's unpack it. I analyze the fact against international law and I make my conclusions. Once the conclusions are there, I just need to disseminate and advocate for redressing, for justice. Otherwise, I would betray my human rights mandate. So I would like my detractors to confront me on the facts, because this never happens. It's very easy to weaponize anti-Semitism against people who criticize the state of Israel. But look, Israel could be led by Buddhists, Christians, Muslims. My assessment wouldn't change, because anti-Semitism is discrimination against the Jews because they're Jews, like anti-Palestinian racism is discrimination against the Palestinians as Palestinians. It's very dangerous what you call my detractors are doing, because not only they belittle the violence that has led to the Holocaust, it's not me. It's because I recognize the gravity of what has led to the Holocaust that I say never again against the Jews, never against anyone else. There is also this continuous attack of any critique of the state of Israel. Now, criticizing Israel is anti-Semite. This is preposterous, and this is a way to dehistoricize Israel's responsibility. And also, I would like to point to the Jerusalem Declaration on Antisemitism that has been signed by 350 Jewish scholars, experts on Holocaust and genocide studies. I mean, even those who have written the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is the mother of this confusion because it conflates critique of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism, even them have rejected the use that is made of the IHRA definition. The reason why the government has embraced it is because there is a lot of pressure from pro-Israel groups in this country and elsewhere in the world. And the reason why they are so successful is because a lot of us are cowards. And we do not talk about it in order not to be accused of anti-Semitism. But this is not what human rights efforts are about.
In the last year, Israeli forces have bombed all of the universities in Palestine. They've bombed hospitals. They've bombed ambulances. They've bombed schools as well. The justification is that there are terrorists who are in these schools or in these ambulances or in these hospitals or in these universities. And that makes these spaces legitimate targets. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to that?
And you see the fallacy of it, because there is no longer a presumption of innocence. The dehumanization of the Palestinians put forward by the Israelis has become a general phenomenon, because in this country, where you continue to claim that this is self-defense, you dehumanize an entire population. You ask me the evidence that Israel has committed genocide. Let's unpack it. I mean, you said it. The destruction of 11 old universities, the destruction of schools, of arable land, of the fishing boats, everything, mosques, the National Archive, 80% of the homes. Why Gaza had to be destroyed? Why the people had to be punished like that? Everyone was a terrorist? If we believe so, let me bring you back to the acts of the Nuremberg trial, where a Nazi official was asked to justify why he was killing Jewish civilians. And he was saying they are a security threat. And he was saying, but the kids, the children, what did the children do? They would grow into security threats. Do you see the fallacy of this argument? Do you see what happens when you stop seeing the other as a human and we see him or her or children as a potential threat? We need to bring our reason back, because this is the only way. If we don't see the dehumanization of the other that is in full swing now, we will not be able to end this, and it will be extremely detrimental both to the Palestinians and to the Israelis.
Francesca Albanese, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant on Ricochet Media. Producer and sound engineer, Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music by Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Killoran. I'm Adrian Harewood. I'll talk to you next time.